Good evening. I think at 6 o'clock we'll get started. My name is James Alarid. I'm the Deputy Utility Manager of Engineering with the County Utilities. And Amy Ewing is Daniel B. Stevens, who prepared the plan. And she'll be going through a PowerPoint to just take us through the various sections and the changes that we've done in the plan since our last issuance of it in 2006. I'd like to start tonight to just kind of get the word out on an item that's been in the media a lot lately, which is the chromium plume that exists out on Lano property. But some of the recent media articles have put some misinformation that sounds pretty alarming about the drinking water supply in Los Alamos. So want to assure everybody that's not the case. It exists, but it doesn't exist in our drinking water wells. Our water is safe to all safe drinking water standards. In addition, we sample and test for chromium. We have extensively since 2007, jointly with Lano, just because we know that it's a regional issue. So thought we might see a few more people here with concerns because it's been pretty widespread. But just let you know that the Department of Public Utilities, we work closely with Lano, and we have been for years. And this is, it's something that's a regional issue, but it's not an issue with our drinking water now. We don't see it being a problem anytime soon as well. So those opening remarks, would like to probably just jump right into the presentation. Amy, if you want to start out, feel free and ask questions as we're going through. And thanks for coming.
Great. Hi. Some of you look familiar from when we did this last, so you'll have a little review. Sorry about that, but we'll move through it. My name's Amy Ewing. I work for a company called Daniel B. Stevens and Associates in Albuquerque, and I've been working on this update. As James said, we had published the original long-range water supply plan in 2006, so this is an update of that existing plan. And that's really common, you know, that you would update those plans on about the 10-year horizon, or more frequently, potentially, if there's some reason to do that. So just to give you an overview of this presentation, we will provide an overview of the plan updates. So some of those sections of that original plan are largely unchanged, but you know, the water system is the same, the kind of overview of the community is largely unchanged, but some of the things have changed significantly, especially the water demand projections, and then we'll also take any public comment and questions. So as an introduction, the water utility, as you know, supplies water for the community of Los Alamos, also White Rock, the Laboratory, and Bandelier. And so these long-range water supply plans, these are prepared very often by municipalities or counties, utilities, to just, it's really a water rights planning document to really look at, you know, what's our water supply, what's our projected demand, do those things match well? If not, what will we do to rectify that problem? So these are plans that are very often required by the state. And in the case of Los Alamos's plan, the Office of the State Engineer gave us some comments on that 2006 plan, largely related to water demand, because what we projected at that time didn't happen. So they were really eager to see an update. They haven't seen this update yet, but you know, since that didn't happen, what the projections of population were back when we wrote that plan in 2006, let's do a new, fresh look at what the water supply needs are in the future. Okay, so the objective of these plans, I mentioned, we project demands, and we compare that to what we think the available water supply is. In the case of this plan, we've also considered water quality. That's rare. We don't usually do that in these plans, but because there's so many things that, you know, just up here, it's better to look at everything in one plan. So that's what we've done. Also looking at water rights risks, there's some, we'll go through that a little bit, but up here, there's the water rights are a little bit of a unique situation as well. So we've covered that. So really the overall objective is that we really want to make certain that there's enough water to meet future demands. So that's the full purpose of these plans. And you guys are the community of Los Alamos is a little bit unique. Some of these plans, often communities do them, and there's not even a public process because it's just really a utility planning for water rights. But it's great to have public involvement with them as well. I think it makes it better. So what we've done with this plan, we followed the organization of the original plan, the 2006 plan. And so we started with that document, and then we've updated it. So I'll just give you the table of contents of the plan right here. And then we'll go through not all of these sections because some of them, there's not a lot to talk about and not a lot has changed. But this is the full table of contents, and then we'll go through some of the more changed sections. So of course there's the introduction and an overview of the water system. And then there's a pretty detailed overview of the hydrogeology and potential risks to the water supply. We have a section discussing the water rights, another section on water demand, and then the comparison of the supply and demand. Another new section, actually a completely new section since the 2006 plan, was to really look at the potential impacts of climate change, right? So that's not something that was in the last plan, but what could that do? You know, so that's a new chapter that's been added, and we'll talk about that. There's a section on water conservation. Sometimes these plans are pretty much full water conservation plans in addition to being this water rights plan. But in the case of Los Alamos, there's a standalone water conservation plan that's very good and is updated. So we have reported on that and updated where there's new goals, but we haven't done a complete water conservation plan as a part of this plan, whereas the 2006 plan did include a full water conservation plan. And finally, we have a section on recommendations. Okay, so going through a couple of these sections of most interest. So the water supply, the water system for the county, there's 12 production wells that are used to supply groundwater from the regional aquifer beneath the Pajarito Plateau. These are deep wells. The depths are up to 3,000 feet below the ground surface, and water levels, the depth to water in those wells, it ranges from about 250 to 1,200 feet below ground surface. Okay. 2 applications have been recently filed with the New Mexico Office of the State Engineer. So the county applied to add a new point of diversion for a new well. And so that new well, that'll be well number 13 in the system. That new well will be called Ottawa Well 2. And so that permit application was filed in April 2016, and the county was issued an exploratory permit to go ahead and drill that. And so the county and their contractors are underway with pushing that forward now. So that's going to be a brand new production well for the system. Another application of note that was filed with the New Mexico Office of the State Engineer was filed in May of 2016, and that was a joint application between the county and DOE, and that was to make available water rights for this chromium interim measure project that's underway now with the chromium contamination. So we'll talk about that project a little bit more, but water is being used for that project right now. They're, pumping water out, treating it, re-injecting it. So an application was filed jointly, and then emergency authorization was received back in September, and so that project is underway. So looking at section 3, the risks to water supply, you have a lot of saturated thickness here. The aquifer is very thick. You're very lucky. There are a lot of communities in New Mexico that have a lot less water and a much bigger planning issue in front of them. So that's marvelous for the community of Los Alamos. So the demonstrated saturated thickness is at least 1,900 feet. And there are water level declines. So that just indicates that you are drawing more water out of the ground than is recharging. So kind of like a checking account, your net balance is declining. And so these are things we like to look at, what are the declines? Because, in a perfect world, we would have the recharge balancing what you're removing, but really that's very difficult, and almost nowhere is that occurring, at least in the state of New Mexico. So on the slide, it lists those 3 well fields, and those are average declines over a period of decades. So in the case of Pajarito well field, looking at 1965 to 2016, the average reduction in the depth to water is on the order of a foot a year. For the Ottawa well field, between 1990 and 2016, just less than a foot a year. And then the Guaje well field, that's a little bit higher, so almost on the order of 3.5 feet per year. So because there's so much water in the aquifer, those rates of reduction are not alarming, but it's just important to keep tracking that information so that you know if those rates are increasing or changing in any way. So as James was talking about, the production wells, obviously there's quite a lot of monitoring that's done to the water quality, as well as I was just talking about, the water levels. We monitor that information too. But the Department of Public Utilities does routine monitoring in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act, and LANL also does additional monitoring of these wells. So all monitoring to date of these production wells would indicate, like James was saying, that chromium is not in the production wells, and the water meets all of the standards, all the water quality standards. So that monitoring will be ongoing. So in this current plan update, we discussed the known contamination and how that relates to the various applicable water quality standards. But again, those issues are not in the production wells. So going through a couple of the more notable issues with water quality, there's perchlorate contamination, and that's present beneath Mortondad Canyon. So in 2015, the concentrations of perchlorate, some of them exceeded the compliance order on consent that LANL had at that time. And so the screening level at that time was 4 micrograms per liter, that's 4 parts per billion, in one of the monitoring wells. And so the detections here it's listing, they ranged from 7 to 9 parts per billion, so above that 4 screening level. That screening level has changed, and so going forward, the new screening level is 13.8 micrograms per liter. So if the concentrations that are detected in that one monitoring well stay about the same to what they've been in the past, in the future that won't even be an exceedance of this current screening level, but this is still something that will be monitored over time. So James was talking about this hexavalent chromium. So as we all know, that plume is present in the regional aquifer, and it came from this blowdown of potassium dichromate that was used in this power plant cooling tower, and that practice ended in 1972. So in 2006 in the plan, this wasn't well defined in any way. So and that work is ongoing, you know, further definition of this plume location and extent. But really there's a lot more information now than there was in 2006, and so that's gone into this plan. The standard for this chromium, it's a human health standard from the Water Quality Control Commission, and that standard is 50 micrograms per liter. So in 2015, that's the data set that we really went into detail with in this update. There were 5 monitoring wells, so none of the production wells, but these 5 monitoring wells did have exceedances. So the concentrations that were seen in those 5 monitoring wells that were above the standard, they ranged from 117 to 915 micrograms per liter. So compared to that standard of 50. So LANL put together an interim measure work plan that they published in May of 2015. And so that outlined how it was that they plan to control the movement of the contaminated groundwater while they figure out the full remediation plan for the contamination. So that document is something that we looked at and that we put some information about in our plan. So as we were talking about already, they plan to pump that contaminated groundwater out of the ground, treat it, and then re-inject it back in the aquifer, and that is already underway. Some of that work is underway. So in July of 2015, there was another LANL document that was published. That's the work plan for the chromium plume center characterization. So that's how, what do they need to do to further investigate the nature and extent of the contamination. So these actions are also underway, and we talk about that some in this plan as well. Okay, so the water rights section, this is really interesting. So in the 2006 plan, we actually didn't treat the water rights ownership as being different in any way. It was just one water rights file with the total number of water rights, and that was that. But actually, it's much more complicated than that. So the original file, that one file, the water rights file, all of that was owned originally by the DOE. And in 2001, ownership of 70% of that volume was transferred to the county, and then DOE retained 30% ownership. And until 2011, there was a long-term lease in place where the county had a lease for all of the rest of that water right. So the DOE owned 30%, but the county had a lease for all of it. So that's really why it wasn't detailed in the original plan. This long-term lease was in place, so the ownership was not such an issue. But that lease expired in 2011, so that meant that we included a little more information in this plan about that situation. So as we talked about, that joint application was filed last year for that chromium plume interim measure project, and I think that's 679 acre feet. But the county is currently working with DOE in order to get a new lease. They would like to have that long-term lease for that full portion of the water rights owned by DOE, and that's 1,662.39 acre feet. It couldn't be round. So when they do that, get that lease in place, of course, that will be used to continue to supply LANL with water, as well as other customers that the county utility supplies with water. Okay. So looking forward at water demand, between 1950 and 2000, the population in the county increased. And then since 2000, it has decreased the population by about 2%. So diversions of water increased between 1950 and 1990, largely due to increased population. And then water diversions have decreased between 1990 and 2010. So part of that's due to water conservation, part of it's due to fewer people. But what's really interesting about this community, what LANL's doing has a huge implication for the water utility. And so as a part of this plan, we've requested and gotten projections, but fundamentally they're not really sure, So you do your best to plan, and then you update these plans periodically in order to do your best at bracketing possible future conditions. But that really has a lot to say about what happens here with water. So this plot, I know it's kind of tiny, but this is just showing the historical water diversions all the way from 1947 through 2016. The different colors are almost imperceptible up there, but towards the beginning you see there's some more surface water is being diverted at that time, less so more recently. So the little blue sections are surface water, the yellow are groundwater. So that's just kind of showing the change in diversions over time. Those dotted lines, dashed and dotted lines, those are just showing what the limits are of the water rights. So we'll get into some more detail about more dashed and dotted varieties of choice on different, who owns what and how that relates to water demand that we're projecting. But just on this graph, I show the lower dotted line, that's the volume of the county plus the DOE groundwater rights, so groundwater only. So that's 5,541.3 acre feet. So you can see that, there for a while in like the, mid to late 70s, it was getting close up there to that limit, but hasn't been really that close to that groundwater right limit for some time. That dashed line that's a lot further up on the plot, almost there at the top, that's just showing that the county has rights to 1,200 acre-feet of surface water from the San Juan Chama project. So if you sum 1,200 to that groundwater number, then it moves that total up. Okay, so we went through and looked at the customer water use data for 2016 in this plan, and this pie plot just shows what the breakdown is of water use in 2016. And it's pretty fun to do these for different communities because every community is totally different, you know? But in the case of Los Alamos, single-family residential water use is about 46% of total water diversion, and multifamily residential 11%. The industrial, commercial, and institutional uses about 15%, and then the laboratory is almost 28% in 2016 of the total demand. So then if you look at this on a monthly basis in 2016, oh good, you can tell the difference of the colors. So your color, it looks like gray and black up there. It's 2 shades of purple over here. But the lower bars that are the gray up there, that's the lab. And you'll notice there's not a huge amount of variability month to month. You know, there's some. But it's not this huge seasonal change, which is what you see with the community. And so those upper bars, the darker ones, that's the community, well, the county, although the, you know, the residential and commercial and everyone except the lab. So you see, as you would expect, the summer months, the water use is much higher because everyone's irrigating their properties, right? So water use is greater in the summertime. If you look at my July column there, we've put that there's 73% in July was the community's use and 27% the lab. And the total numbers are in the little box there, just indicating that the lab used about 880 acre-feet and the county 2320 in 2016. Okay, so in 2006, the projections for population showed really marked increase. There was projection of pretty steadfast growth, and they were looking at the potential for up to 25,000 people in the community by 2020. So that, of course, was before that 2008 housing market crash where everything changed. So that didn't happen. The 25,000 people did, well, we're not to 2020 yet, but that projection, that slope of growth did not occur. So really what was seen between 2000 and 2010 was really a decline in the population, and that was largely due to some cutbacks at Lano. So in 2010, per the census, the county had 17,950 residents. So the state engineer's office gave us comments on that 2006 plan. So we really, you know, we wanted to update that plan, but also make certain that we addressed all of what they had to say about that earlier version. And so their largest issue was with our projections. And so we talked, when we started this project, we talked about, well, how can we do this better? You know, how can we project population better? And it's always an unknown, and we always do low and high projections so that hopefully you're bracketing what may occur. But so what we did in this case is we got lucky. The state engineer's office and the Interstate Stream Commission, they just did a really big effort to update all 16 of the regional water plans. And so actually our firm was involved with some of that work, but they hired a demographer and they did population projections for all of the planning regions in the state. And so in some cases those are pretty difficult to pick apart, but in the case of Los Alamos County, it's Los Alamos County, right? So they did population projections as a part of that update process for the state regional water plan. And that regional water plan, those were just published last year. So it's pretty recent information. So what we did was we took those population projections and then then we took the per capita water use number that we calculated, which is the per person volume, per day. And so we just multiplied the population projections that the state got by the 2016 per capita use here in the county to project demand. And then, of course, the landfill demand is a separate thing that we got from them. They provided us with a 10-year projection, and those projections, they range from 781 up to 1,505 acre feet per year. What I did then, it was increasing over time. So that 1,505 at 2027, I really wanted to project, I need to project to 2060. It's impossible for them to do that. So I took their 1,505 and I held it constant all the way to 2060 because I'd rather have something in there than nothing. And then an update can be made at some later date. But they gave us a 10-year projection and we stretched it out to 40, which is what the water planning period is that's required. So I have a couple of tables to show you. This table here is showing population projections for the county. And so the low projection you see in that middle column, this is by decade from 2020 to 2060. So in 2020, there's 17,988 people. And then over the decades that follow, you see that population is kind of slowly declining. So that's our low projection. In the case of the high projection, it's the other direction. So by 2020, that would have 20,000 people, and then population increases with each decade up to 2060, where you're just over 22,000. So if you take those population numbers, like we were talking about, and you multiply them by per capita water use, and then sum in the Los Alamos demands, you get these numbers. So this is total projected demand, and I realize they're kind of squirrely, they bounce around. That's because the landfill numbers bounce around. So those are the total demand that we're projecting by decade in acre feet per year. So that's the county plus the lab. So let's see, so we're looking at a projection on the low from about 3,800 acre feet up to over 4,000 acre feet in 2060, or in the case of the high projection, just over 4,100 acre feet in 2020 to just over 5,000 acre feet per year in 2060. So, as we were saying back when that plot was shown, the county has rights to use 1,200 acre feet of San Juan Chama project water. So that's surface water that's brought in. It's a trans-basin diversion. I'm sure you all know about this, but it's Colorado River Basin water that's brought into the Rio Grande Basin. And so a number of different communities have rights to that water. That project was finished in 1972, so these deals were made a very long time ago, and then the project was constructed. The construction costs have been paid for getting the water over into the Rio Grande Basin. Some of the other communities are using this water, not very many, but Santa Fe is and Albuquerque is. So, if the community was to bring this water online, it would absolutely diversify the water supply, because you would be using now not only groundwater, you'd have surface water available as well. And that could be used to help mitigate future effects due to climate change or contamination or what have you. In the case of Albuquerque, they're doing recharge, and they're doing as much surface water supply as possible during the years where there's surface water available, and saving groundwater for years of drought. So, it just gives you a little more flexibility with your planning. Granted, they're big projects if you decide to build one, but there are more communities doing that. To build a project like this now, it would be almost impossible, really, to do one of these trans-basin diversions and bring water in. These types of projects, these planning projects, every once in a while somebody brings up the grand idea of like bringing Missouri River water or something like this. I don't foresee this occurring, but back in the 60s, that was something that was talked about quite a bit more, and in some cases done. Okay, so plots coming our way. This is, these are the demand projections, and then we show our water rights limits on the plots. So I'll give you some text, and then we'll look at a plot, and I'll do it for a couple of different scenarios. So we've run a bunch of different scenarios just to try to get an idea of what's the range of possibility. We don't know what's going to happen, but just for planning purposes, what are the various bounds that could occur? So if we project demand without additional water conservation. There could be additional water conservation, but what if there's not? So if we do a scenario without any additional conservation and no DOE water rights, so let's say they don't lease the water rights that DOE owns, if they don't lease them to the county and they are not available at all, which I don't think that's the future, right? But what if it is? We better look at what that looks like. So in this case, the county-owned groundwater rights, which is this 3878.91, that volume is enough to meet the county's use only under the low water use projections. But if you add in the lab's demand, then only for 2020 can you meet it under that scenario where you don't have the DOE water rights, but you're still supplying Lanall with water. If you do so the water rights volume of just the county groundwater, that's not adequate for the lab and the county together for under the low water use projections in 2030, 40, 50, or 60. So I know that's kind of a lot of words. So here it is graphically shown. So again, this darker color, that's the county, and then the lab is the lighter shade on top. And so each of these columns represents projection of water demand by decade so 2010 is actual data, and then these 2020 through 2060, those are these demand projections. So I warned you, there are lots of dotted lines. So let me tell you, I think I have a pointer. Okay, so the first one you've seen before, this dashed line right here, this 3878.91, that is the county-owned water rights volume, the groundwater volume right there. So now if you add in the DOE groundwater rights, let's skip a line, skip this one. We're going here to this dotted one right here. This dotted number, that's what the groundwater water rights are in total. So what the DOE owns and what the county owns together in sum. If you subtract out what's being used right now, there's a permit for 679 acre feet per year. That's being used right now for this interim measure for the kind of pump and treat project that's underway. Then if you subtract that out, you get this solid line right here, and so that's just for interest's sake on what other groundwater is available maybe today. You know, you can't use all of this groundwater for water supply today because that chromium project is ongoing, but that number that it's going to use, that could change in the future. So it's just nice to kind of look at where all these various limits are. And then that top limit, you've seen that before, this dashed line at the top, that's just showing now everything together. So if we have the county-owned groundwater rights and we have the DOE-owned groundwater rights and we sum in the San Juan Chama water, that's up there at the top. Okay, new scenario. So what if we don't have additional conservation or the DOE water rights, but now we're looking at the high demand projection. So this is, you know, more water, more demand is projected than under that low. So in this case, and I'm going to show you the plot for the next slide, but in this case, the county-owned groundwater rights is adequate to meet the county-only high water use projections for all decades. But if you add in the lab, it's not adequate in any decade. So here's the plot. So this is showing that dashed line right there, if I find it, you can see those dark bars are below that dashed line in all decades, but you add the lab on there and they're above it in all decades. So in the event that you have no additional conservation, you see these high water use projections occur and DOE doesn't lease their water rights, then we have a problem. So that's just, you know, one of the scenarios we look at to fully understand the situation. So what if we have additional conservation, right? So when we did this earlier draft and had public meeting the last time, that was actually about a year ago. I think we're off by about 2 days, so we're on a good schedule here. But we didn't put additional conservation in that last draft, and that was one of the comments we got. People really wanted to see what could happen with conservation, how much water could we save. So it depends on the community, you know, how conserving you want to be and what you want your community to look like, right? So that's a decision for the community to make, but we can certainly run scenarios to see what could that look like. So one of the specific questions that was raised was, you know, what if we became like Santa Fe and really used 90 gallons per person per day? Well, that's like a 40% reduction on water use for this community. But, you know, it could occur, but things would have to change for that to happen. So we did some scenarios with additional conservation. We didn't go right to that 90 gallons per person per day next year, because these kinds of changes take time, right? But we can, in the plan, we detail the reductions over time that we modeled, but we made it a little bit more, you know, over the full planning horizon you would conserve to get there. So I didn't go into detail of my assumptions, but with, in this PowerPoint, in the plan, they're there, but with increased conservation, the county-owned groundwater rights volume is not adequate to meet the county plus the lab projections for 2030, but in all other projection decades, 2020, 2040, 50, and 60, they can meet it. So here's this plot. So those water rights limits on this plot are the same as all the other plots, and this is taking additional conservation into account. So you see 2030 is a little bit high, but if you changed your assumptions on water conservation, you could potentially bring that down. But you know, it's difficult to implement really successful conservation quickly unless there's some kind of emergency situation. So anyway, this is what it looks like with the low water use projection with additional conservation per our timeline that we set out. In the case of high water use projections, it doesn't look as good. It's difficult to meet demand with just the county-owned groundwater rights. It doesn't happen in any decade. So here's that plot showing with additional conservation, you can't meet both the county and the lab's demand just with county-owned groundwater rights. But what I failed to mention on this and the previous, if you have the DOE groundwater rights, you can. So that's this spotted line here again. So if they lease that volume to the county, you can, right, meet these water demand projections that are allowing for conservation savings. So in summary, with these demand projections, if those DOE water rights are not leased to the county and the county continues to be the sole water provider for the lab and the high population projections are realized, even if there's significant conservation, there's not enough water, and you would need to implement a San Juan Chama project in order to meet the projected demands. If my projected demands are off, then things could be different. But with the assumptions and the work that we've done, if all of this occurs, it's not enough. So you need those DOE water rights or something else to occur. Okay. So climate change. So we have a whole chapter on climate change, and I'll just give a couple of slides now about that. But we looked at all of the various research that's been done, both regionally and then also a little further afield. But I think everyone's been hearing quite a bit about this. But regarding impacts that could be anticipated, we're looking at increasing temperatures longer and warmer growing seasons, that means people are going to put more water in their yards, right? So demand for outdoor irrigation is going to increase. In the case of reservoirs, so that's not so much your situation here, but increased evaporation because you're having higher temperatures, right? So some of the communities that are having their water in behind dams are going to have issues with that. And actually the San Juan Chama water is in that situation. Potentially more concentrated and more intense precipitation, the potential for decreasing stream flow in major rivers, and then also we're already seeing this, but there's a change in the distribution of when you get that water. So the stream flow, you know, the snow melt and the stream flow and how that happens in the hydrograph of the year, there's a seasonal shift happening with that, and that's a problem for water utilities to plan for. So the recommendations for mitigating impact from climate change is looking at adaptive management, right? So really, as you get more information, you kind of revise your plan. I mean, that's just good business, and that's really what everyone's doing. But it's super important, you know, to revise as you learn more about what these impacts may be, or as you're collecting more information. Being so reliant on this groundwater actually puts the community of Los Alamos in better shape than situations where everybody, you know, where a community is solely on surface water. That's a little bit more difficult to plan for. So another recommendation is to use research and monitoring to fill knowledge gaps, and again, you know, enhance your planning capabilities and change, as you know, a little bit more. Another recommendation is to continue to implement and update the energy and water conservation plan. So actually that's another thing that's special about Los Alamos. Nobody else really has an energy component with their utility. So that's kind of a neat plan to get to see those two things really looked at together. They're very tied to one another. Each of them has effect on the other, but a lot of communities don't look at that, right? So conjunctively managing surface and groundwater resources, that's what I was talking about in the case of Albuquerque and also Santa Fe. That's really being done in those places, trying to maximize use of surface water when it's available and save the groundwater for times when that surface water won't be available. And then, you know, doing your best to prepare for the increasing risk of large and severe wildfires, right? That's something that's already been seen here, but that's, you know, getting the frequency and severity of those fires are getting worse. Okay, so water conservation. So as I was mentioning earlier, that energy and water conservation plan, it outlines conservation goals. The current version of the plan covers the planning period of 2015 to 2019. It talks about the forming of the Conservation Advisory Group that came on in 2011 to assist with those goals. And then this last bullet, this is brand new. So actually this is going to be in our final draft of this plan, but there's a new goal. So 144 gallons per day is the number that's what we calculated as the per capita water use in 2016. So for the whole system, that's the per person water use per day in 2016. And those numbers change kind of, you know, year to year, especially depending on how much rain there is, because people don't water their yards as much when there's a lot of rain. But 144, that was the number that we got in 2016. So this new goal is calling for a reduction in per capita water use by 9% by 2030, and that was just adopted this fall. So that new goal is to bring that per capita number down to 131 gallons per day. So you're doing more conservation already. So specific conservation goals that the community has that are largely outlined in that existing plan, the water conservation, the energy and water conservation plan, that talks about increasing the education, water conservation education and outreach in public schools, as well as adult education efforts, implementing residential irrigation water audits. So that's when you make staff available to go to a person's home and help them out with that. Also potentially improving the water waste rule and making that more of an enforceable guideline. That's something that's been considered. Also implement incentives for outdoor water conservation. So some communities have rebates for this type of thing. You know, that's one option. And then implement the county's non-potable water master plan as well. So, and that's being done, right? That's underway. Okay, so our recommendations for the plan are things that the county staff is already working on, right? But one really is to pursue the new lease with DOE for the water rights that they own. So, you know, the water planning situation will look a lot brighter when that lease is in hand. And so that's something that's underway, and hoping that that's going to work out very soon. Another recommendation, and something that the county is working on, is to renegotiate the contract with DOE. So there's an existing contract in place that says that the county supplies the lab with an unlimited water supply, and so that's difficult to plan for, right? There are some more involved conditions in there about the lab letting the county know if demand's going to just really skyrocket, you know, like give us some warning on that. But fundamentally it says that, you know, that really they could increase their demands. So the current contract, that will expire in 2019, and so a new contract is needed. So that's something that's underway now, but one of the recommendations, right? It'll be really nice to update this plan at some point in the future when that lease is a known entity and the contract is a known entity as well. And then continuing to work closely with the lab and the environment department regarding the ongoing monitoring of contaminants relating especially to that chromium plume. So also with the recommendations, we recommend, you know, you don't necessarily have to do a full 40-year water plan update every couple years. That's a lot of work. But you can just update the demand analysis and say, okay, well, we know we have this DOE lease in place now, and our contract looks like this with the lab, so we have some bounds on that. And you can, you know, reproject demand per, okay, we've had some successes in water conservation and our per capita has come down. So what does that look like, right? So really doing this water demand analysis every couple of years, or at least in a few years from now, per these couple of unknowns, that would be really, really useful. We've talked a lot during this planning process about San Juan Chama, and you know, whether a project would be needed, it would be expensive. Really having some of these unknowns worked out, and then rerunning this demand analysis would be the best kind of plan for moving forward or not with a plan. So I put down just a list. I think I've hammered them pretty hard, but the unknowns that once they're more defined will better inform the projections will be the new lease for the water rights that DOE owns, the new contract, and then a definition of water demands for this remediation project. So the chromium interim measure project is happening now as they're further delineating the full problem. And so they're pumping, they're treating, they're re-injecting. The New Mexico Office of the State Engineer, they'll give some credit back for the water that gets re-injected, but that's not worked out yet about how much. So in the event that it were 100%, that would be amazing. Probably won't be 100%, but it'll be some number. So right now there's 679 acre feet kind of set aside for this project, for this interim measure project. But when the full remediation project plan is known, and you know, certainly there'll be re-injection as part of that too. But you'll just have to kind of look at what the water demands are going to be for that. And the county's working very closely with the lab on those kinds of issues. Really that the water rights could be under lease to the county in their entirety, and then whatever's needed to be used for the remediation project, you know, that certainly would occur. Okay, so here's one of our little mascots for a project. That's the presentation. I'll take any questions that you have. Yes, ma'am.
So what we could be potentially exposed to would be higher levels, not high enough to raise a red flag, but they would be spread over a long term, right? So I'm wondering, when would the public be notified that, oh, it has reached a level that we're kind of concerned? I hope it's not the EPA, because I want to know when it's 20, say, because to me, that would raise a red flag.
I have two things I want to say, and then I'm going to have James address the public notification process. So the two things that I'll say, the standard that we are looking at is a New Mexico standard, and it's more rigorous than that. So the standard is 50, so micrograms per liter, and that is not in any of the production wells. So you're not getting exposed to it at all. So they're monitoring for that, and so James can address what would happen if they saw it. We're not thinking they will see it, but if they did, he can address what would happen with that and with public notification and with use of a well. But the standard that we look at is the more rigorous New Mexico standard, so that's 50 ppb. So James.
Yes, and can you hear me on this? Okay. So going back to your question, currently there's no hexavalent chromium in our drinking water wells. In our sampling since 2007, we've got total chromium, which is another isotope of chromium that's showing up, and that's showing up a natural background of anywhere from 4 to 7 parts per billion. So in the event that we did see that the plume, two things could happen. The plume could take over geographically, show itself somewhere in the aquifer where a well is. That would be public notified. You would see a lot of things that happen similar to they did in the last couple of weeks. The laboratory would have press releases. We would definitely take a proactive approach and let our customers know what's going on, because the whole time, we're evaluating the risk to everybody. So I think you can just count on that we would be very open about it, very proactive, and we would speak to our customers immediately with the day it starts to impact any presence in any of our drinking water wells.
So that's when if you see the plume getting to the well. What at the same time you're still monitoring. So say you don't see that, but you see a spike in chromium in the water, because you're seeing some now from 4 to 7. So say that spikes up to 20. Are we going to be notified, or since it's below 50, it's still considered healthy?
No, I think this is, we would definitely notify. That would be very alarming if we started to see a trend in our drinking water wells themselves. So we would notify everybody and really step back and look and see what the, do we need to go as far as taking that particular well out of service? We're definitely working, we sample quarterly. So every 3 months we get new information, and that's what we're looking for. If we see a presence, we're going to step back and evaluate and take the appropriate response.
Also, the lab publishes environmental documents every year where they report all of the monitoring data. And so in this plan, we are citing, I think it's a 2016 dated plan with 2015 data. But previous drafts of this, we were looking at earlier versions. So those are public documents that get published every year. So that's something that if you're interested, you can always, they're readable. They have maps and tables of data, and you can look at, and they give presentations and things frequently as well, but those reports are available for you to review. Yes, sir.
Could you clarify where you're seeing the 4 to 7 micrograms per liter chromium hexavalent? Did I misunderstand?
No, I think what I meant to say, we are seeing that as a background, and it's not hexavalent chromium that we're seeing in there from the data that we've seen. Total chromium.
In production wells or observation?
Those are production well numbers. And that's for a calendar year sampling that took place that we reported in our 2016 Consumer Confidence Report. So it's an annual snapshot over the calendar year 2015.
Any specific wells that they were taken from?
I think, no, it's a slew across all our wells. And our high was 7, and our low was 4, and the rest were somewhere in between.
So all of the wells were shut.
There could have been some, all of them were sampled, and I believe so. We showed some background between that. That's the way I understand. We report the high and low among all of our 12 wells.
Okay, because some of the wells don't seem to be located so far away that it's hard to imagine that they would be affected by any chromium plume. So it's kind of, I guess, a little bit confusing. I had not heard that before. Thank you.
As I understand it, there is one well in particular that's within half a mile of the plume, as we currently understand its location, correct?
That is correct.
And the 4 to 7%, do you know what that well has been measured at recently?
I don't know the specifics on that particular well, but it's in that range.
And is that the only well that looks like it could be in the path of the plume if the plume continues to flow on?
That is the one that's closest.
PM4.
Yes.
Isn't it 3?
PM3. Yeah, Parrito Mesa Well 3 along the truck route. About a half mile further east in the same general direction, where they've seen some transport, there's Parrito Mesa Well number 1. So that would be about 3/4 of a mile from the plume.
Yeah, but the county has the opportunity to turn those wells off. If they see something in that well, they would turn it off. That water could be treated as well, but likely they would just shut it off, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
So when did you start seeing the chromium? Is this something that's going back in time, or is it just, you said in those wells? You weren't measuring it before, or what?
I don't believe we were measuring it before 2007. When it became, I can tell you what I know for sure. I know in 2007, we started a collaborative effort sampling on a regular basis with a laboratory. And that's when I'm certain we have numbers up to 2007. I'm not 100% certain that we were not testing before then. I don't believe so. I think it was a reaction to the presence in the area that started the sampling.
So it's been kind of a constant number in those wells, or is it changing? Or what?
It has varied a little bit. I don't know prior years, but I think it went up into, the low, 11 parts per billion, maybe tops I've seen in some of the consumer confidence reports in the last 4 or 5 years. But it's always stayed very, very relatively low.
You had something?
I'm looking here on page 16 and 17 of the handout, basically those bar plots.
Okay, let me go back to a second.
My real question, I hate to say the same thing about any of those bar plots. It seems to me that it looks like starting, you're adding in the Lano pumping amount of 679 acre feet or whatever that number was per year for chromium cleanup. That seems to go on for 2030, 2040.
Forever, yeah.
2060, is that based on consultation with Lano that they're going to have a
No.
30-year?
It's supposed to, I forget the year, it's like, what is it, a 25-year or something like that. In the interim measure, the project has a term on it, and it's some number that's less, correct, you're pointing out a good point, it's less than this planning period. But I would bet that number doesn't go to 0 at that moment. So that interim measure project, that'll continue for this term while they better delineate and refine the ultimate remediation project. The water demands for the ultimate remediation project, there's been no work to date yet on what those numbers would be. So I don't think it will be 0. It probably won't be 679, but I just left the 679 in there till the end as a placeholder because we don't know what the number is. So it could be higher. It could be lower. I would bet it won't be 0. But you're making a very good point. That's not that project is not planned to go through 2060. Yes.
I'll just add some clarification. I pulled up one of our old drinking water quality reports, and we were reporting on chromium.
Oh, good.
Before. Yeah, so in 2004, our chromium ranged between 5 to 6 parts per billion. So,
In all wells.
and, right, it's a range from the 12, so,
Does that include the Wahi field as well?
Yes, it does.
Okay, there are different materials. I know the well screens in the Wahi wells are stainless steel. Don't hold me to this, but there could be some, I guess my question is, could the total chromium be leaching from the well casing materials themselves? I don't know, I'm just asking.
Yeah, I don't know if that's a possibility.
It would seem like the Wahi wells in particular would not be affected by any plume in Morton Canyon. Even wells further to the kind of the north. Anyway, so I guess it raises a question. If we're seeing chromium in wells that you would not expect to be impacted by the plume, the next question is, are they from something else? That's really the point I guess I'm trying to get to. And could that same phenomenon be occurring in all of the wells, since all the levels are apparently about the same?
Yes, so we've been speaking to a lot of hydrologists recently about this, and there's natural occurring chromium-3, trivalent chromium. That is a natural product, and we expect that's probably something we're seeing throughout. So we believe it's a natural occurring background of component of chromium and not hexavalent chromium that we're seeing.
What else? Yes, sir.
I just wanted to know the background of your company.
Oh, sure. We are a water resources and environmental engineering firm. Our founder was Dan Stevens. He was a New Mexico Tech professor that started a consulting firm. So I think we're about 30 years young now. We have on the order of about 100 people doing a range of projects, environmental remediation and landfill caps and things, but a lot of water resources work and water system engineering. We do a lot of water planning, especially in New Mexico. We have some offices in California and also in Texas, and now we're affiliated 2 years ago, we're now affiliated with this company called Geologic Associates out of Southern California, and they're more engineering and geotechnical type work, but they have recently purchased now another firm in Arizona called Clear Creek Associates that we're affiliated with now also. This is a very, very strong water resources firm, so we're delighted to have them as well on some of our projects. So we're kind of a changing company a little bit, but employee-owned, small consulting in the water and environmental arenas. Mm-hmm. Yes.
This is a question to go back in history, and so we may not have the right folks. Was there any rhyme or reason to DOE hanging on to 30% of the water right when it got transferred to the county?
There was. The reason it was a 70-30 split, because 30% was historical demand of the laboratory, and I don't know what the particular reason they made that up, but they wanted to keep ownership of at least what they had historically used.
And is there any difference to the county of having a leased water right versus a contracted water right with the Department of Energy?
A lease or a contract would accomplish what we need. We just can't count on water in our future planning, especially the decades ahead, on water that we do not have the right to make decisions, call our own. And
speaking, DOE would be cutting off its nose despite its face to not allow the county to supply water to the lab operations.
Yes, it's, we will find a way through this because they can't exist. We have to find a solution to this.
Yes, ma'am.
Can you give some update on the latest thing on that plume? They've been doing this pump and treat for a while now.
Do you want me to?
You, please.
I'll write it. So
James knows much
the
more
latest
than me.
thing, so we know in 2015, there was, we secured the water rights so they could begin what they're calling their interim measures plan, which a series of what they're calling extraction wells from the area of the plume that has the strongest concentration. And the plan is to extract that water that's the stronger chromium content, treat it on the surface, and then they have a series of injection wells that they're trying to put on the perimeter of the plume, where they have identified it likely as. So the plan is for them to pump, treat the dirtiest of the water, clean it, and re-inject it strategically in these injection wells. So the plan is kind of on that interface of where the plume, they think the edge is. The clean water will do two things. It'll push the plume back towards the source, and there'll be a little bit of some chromium that'll go past, but that'll dilute itself and diminish the plume downstream. So that's kind of been what they're working on for at least a year and a half now. And they also have some measures where they're telling us they're looking at a biological treatment. They're injecting a glucose source. I believe it's molasses products or something similar to that when it's in the groundwater, reacts with the chromium, changes the form to a safe form of chromium or some other elements. So, but that's kind of been the ongoing activity. That's what the interim measures program that they have going is comprised of. The whole time they're sampling and analyzing from all their existing wells. Most recently that we saw the flurry of activity in the media, they completed what they're calling injection well number 6. It's the newest of their injection wells. And that was, per earlier modeling, going to be at the perimeter outer edge of the plume. But when they took samples, they found out that it had a little higher concentration than expected. It was above the 50 parts per billion, which is the state standard. So that's kind of the event that took place over the last 6 weeks, where we've started to see some media coverage and a lot of talk and the new concerns that have come out. Don't know if that answered your question, Ms. Taylor.
So, I guess that's the last thing I had heard, that last well was a surprise. So does that mean you're not going to be, you're going to drill, I guess they'll drill outside of that well now?
Yep.
Again?
Right now, we met with the laboratory end of last week, so they are right now looking, they're trying to pick the best path forward. And they'll be presenting something, sound in about a month's time, to the NMED on how what their next action is. But they don't know. That's a possibility.
So in those extraction wells, have they found lower levels now? So they've been pumping this for quite a while now. I don't know how long, but are they seeing any change, or is it just like the bottomless pit?
I think, I couldn't tell you if they're seeing any change, but I don't think they were expecting to see a major change. Right now, this is just exploring to see if the concept is showing any progress. So it's not a major cleanup effort at this point. They're still trying to understand the dynamics and extent of the plume, and I think that's the main part of it. So that's when we say it's an interim measure is going to lead ultimately to some type of remediation project down the road, where this could be many years. The wells are generally, the laboratory wells are predominantly towards the top of the aquifer. So they could vary anywhere from a few hundred feet to almost 1,000, depending on where they're located.
Any other questions?
Right. We want to thank everybody for coming out. No, this is interesting times, and we'll be assured we'll be open with our customers, and we'll be communicating often if anything changes.